And in the news sheet, you'll find an outline for this morning. It's there, and there'll be some stuff coming up on the screen. You can write or doodle. I'm told doodling is a good thing. Now, if you're not used to being here on a Sunday morning, if you've not been here for the last few weeks, you won't know that we're going through this book of Ephesians that was written by St. Paul to the church in Ephesus, that's now part of Turkey, and it was written in such a way as to help Christians live for Christ. It's an extraordinary book. It comes really in two halves. The first bit is all theology with profound practical implications. The second half is largely practice, but every bit of practice has some kind of theological implication to it as well. So the first half tends to be theology, and the second half tends to be practice, but they're all intimately linked with one another. And today, Paul really hits the ground running with his talking and his writing about how human relationships should function. And that's why I've called it Being a Christian on the Front Line. Unless you happen to buy the CD this morning, we put a different label on the CD. I changed it. I put my hand up and say it was my fault. I'm sorry. I'm fascinated that Keith is not the only not the first person to whom I've given this reading, and we've actually started at verse 22 and not 21. Bear in mind, in the Greek text, there are no chapter divisions, no headings, no verse numbers, nothing. It's just text. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start at verse 21, because the big idea, and this is what Keith was reading about, is there as a headline. And we find this Paul using this method over and over again in the book of Ephesians. He gives us a headline, and then he unpacks what that headline looks like. For example, look at chapter 6, verse 10. Finally, he says, be strong in the Lord. Well, what does being strong in the Lord look like? Well, he unpacks it and talks about the armour of God. Back in chapter 3, for example, he said, I kneel before the Father, from whom the whole family on heaven and earth is named. So what does that entail? Well, it entails me praying for you. And you get this wonderful prayer. So the way Paul operates is he gives us a headline, and then he unpacks it. Now, what we've got here in verse 21 is the headline, and here it is, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he unpacks it with those wonderful verses that Keith read to us earlier on, with wives and husbands, children and parents, employers and employees, and so forth. And we'll get on to that in a moment. So the big idea that covers this whole passage is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Just before Jesus' death, when he was carrying all the tension of knowing what was just about to happen, what did he do? Did he ask for sympathy? Did he ask for people to sit around him and put their hands on him? No. He washed his disciples' feet. And he made this very telling observation. He said, my dear friends, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, because that is what I am. Now that I, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Why do we submit to one another out of reverence for Christ? Because that's what Jesus did. He even submitted to washing the feet of his disciples. That is true servant leadership. Yes, he was the leader, he was the teacher, he was the Lord. But he never asserted that position as one that makes him superior to other people. He always acted in humility. And here he did the servant's job. We submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. When Jesus died, He had the right, he had the authority and the power to call down angels to get him off the hook when he faced the cross. But he submitted to the human authorities. And in some way, as he dies, he could see the bigger picture, which was your salvation and mine. And if we go into the book of Hebrews, we find this amazing phrase, that for the joy that was set before him, Christ endured the cross. Somehow, he could see the joy that was ahead of him and was willing to endure the suffering and pain for the sake of that joy, both his and ours. God is redeeming his world in that act. And when it comes to redeeming his world today, he uses the most unlikely bunch of people. He uses the Christian church, which is you and me. So in what areas does this attitude of mutual submission apply? Well, we just had them read to us. And they apply to wives and to husbands, for example, to all the key relationships that we have in human society. It relates to the way husbands relate to wives, how children relate to parents, how workers relate to employers, how employers relate to workers. This is what Paul is writing about. And we know that if these kind of principles were worked out right across society, society would be stable and strong. It is so often where these relationships break down that we run into trouble. So you've just got them listed on your sheet. Should we just scamper through them? Should we have a look at what Paul has to say? So first of all, let's ask ourselves, what does he say about how wives should relate to husbands? Now, I want to show you something here that really surprised me when I discovered it while I was preparing for this talk. One of the things that preachers like me need to do very often is to go back to the original Greek text. And that's why Bible college training and an awareness of the original text of the Bible is so important for people who regularly teach and preach. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the Greek text of this verb up on the screen. There it is. Now, don't worry, please, about the hieroglyphics. You don't need to know that, but you can certainly see the words, can't you? Now what I'm going to do is to put the English words above the Greek ones. And here they come. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Yeah? Now, do you notice something interesting there? Do you notice that there's a word that's in English but not in Greek? And this is going to put a cat among the pigeons. The word submit is just not there. Paul didn't write it. So why is it that we've got it in there in the first place? Well, we've got it in there because the translators infer it from verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So what Paul is doing here, he's saying we must submit to one another, and I'm going to show you various areas where that submission takes place. And the first one is wives and husbands. And it's vital, if we're going to get the right balance and understand this, as his first hearers understood it, to receive the message that is there in the text. Paul is using the general principle, and that's the structure of the paragraph. And he's applying it to wives and husbands. Now, why should I tell you all this? Well, because I have heard and seen too many of us men use this passage as a scriptural excuse to get our own way. I've heard too many men say to me, well, I'm the head of the household, so she ought to submit to me. The Bible teaches mutual submission. It may not always be that blatant, but that's the gist behind the comment sometimes. And what bothers me is the hard attitude of some men. And I can slip into this as well. I want to get my way. In my pastoral practice, I have dealt with far too many situations of women who have been bullied by their husbands and those husbands who see this text as an excuse for their own bullshiness. However, submission here does mean respecting a husband's leadership and headship. And the way in which the word head is used in the scriptures is the same way that you use the source of a stream or the source of a river. It's the place from which it all emanates from. So therefore, creating the right spirit, seeing that the home is safe and joy-filled and Christ-centred, is the husband's primary responsibility. And the wife hopefully goes along with his spiritual lead. It's a voluntary self-giving to a lover who is charged by God to provide constructive care and set the atmosphere in a family. But not only does Paul talk about wives and husbands, and here's my graphic about the structure. Sorry, perhaps that should have been the previous slide. There's the general principle, submit to one another, and he applies it in these 5 areas. Wives and husbands and wives, children and parents, workers and employers to workers. We'll proceed into husbands and wives, shall we? Oh, here we go. Yeah. Somewhere in the millions of words that Leo Tolstoy, the author, wrote, you'll read this. The vocation of every man and woman is to serve other people. Now, doesn't that sound just wonderful? But before we take his word for it, perhaps we should listen to his wife Sophia, who wrote about him after his death. Here's Sophia, and what she said was this. There was so little genuine warmth about him. His biographers will tell you how he helped the labourers carry buckets of water. But no one will ever know that he never gave his wife a moment's rest, and never in all of our 32 years of marriage gave his child a drink of water or spent 5 minutes by his bedside to give a chance for his wife to rest a while from her labours. How sad. How can I show submitted love to my wife in such a way that will enable her to love the Lord and to love life? Well, these are just my hints. From my standpoint as a husband, she needs my devotion. To be married to someone means that you discover a myriad of imperfections in them, and they discover a myriad of imperfections in you. That's life. I need to be committed to Rosie despite her imperfections. Because I know if you counted the imperfections of hers and mine, I know where the longest list would be. And it's not hers. She needs my affection. She needs to know that she is cherished and that she is precious. She needs to know that there is no one in the world who can do in my life what she's achieved. She needs to know my protection. She needs to know that when the pressure is on us, I will shoulder the burden against the rough and tumble of life. That we're in this together. And if she needs a place to hide, I will provide the place of security and peace for her. She needs my openness. She needs to know what I feel as well as what I think. And in a sense, that's one of the things that we really had to wrestle with when we were writing The Road Not Chosen. It's written in 2 voices. Sometimes it's me speaking, sometimes it's Rosie, and we identify which is which, and sometimes it's both of us. I found being as open as that quite difficult, and she was my helper here. And that's probably why Paul is so clear about husbands loving their wives. Because he does put a verb in there, and he tells us that we husbands are to love our wives. And it's not the regular word for sentimental or married love that was used in the Greek language. It was the rich, deep word that he used describing Christ's love for the church. It's a love that is sacrificial. It's a love that goes the extra mile. It's a love that will give. It's a love that doesn't seek to get. That's the kind of love that Paul is describing husbands should show towards their wives. It's deep, costly, permanent, sacrificial love. It's love that is given without a hidden motive. It's love that means going without the gadget that you've set your heart on so that she can decorate the room the way she'd like it. It's a love that might mean going to see her film instead of yours. Yes, I too have sat right through Mamma Mia. And before we run away with the idea that, well, that's all very well for you, my life is a bit different. When Paul was writing in the time where he was ministering, there wasn't an emphasis on the nuclear family as we have. Families were much larger, much more complex. And so what he's seeking to do is to bring these principles into everyday life, whatever particular shape your family has. Because these are the principles that will help us to have a stable society, where love and sacrifice and submission are mutually extended to one another. So husbands and wives. Then Paul talks about children and parents. Children, Paul says, obey your parents. And again, he puts a verb in here. And it's significant that Paul says at this point that they should obey. There is clearly expected to be obedience between children and parents. Now, in the first century, children were often marginalised in the adult world, alongside women, actually. So the fact that Paul gives them here an equal place with adult men and employers shows that he valued them hugely. So what does he say? Well, look at verse 1 of chapter 6. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now, what does in the Lord mean here? Does it mean that if your parents aren't Christians, you don't need to obey them? No, it doesn't. Obedience is part of God's plan for stable family life, so that when they ask you to obey, then as a child, do as if Jesus was talking to you. It also indicates that if a parent expects a child to do something that is clearly outside of God's will, there may be a case for obeying God as the higher authority. Because the Bible says we are to honour our father and mother. Why? So that it will go well with us. It's a commandment that comes with a promise. If we honour our parents, life will be better for us. And then there's the converse. You'll see that in verse 4. When children obey their parents, the fathers need to avoid winding them up. And fathers, don't wind up your children to make them angry, but nurture them using the Lord's framework and guidance. My paraphrase. And I'm not sure whether I put it on the screen. No, I didn't. Fathers, don't wind up your children, verse 4, to make them angry, but nurture them using the Lord's framework and guidance. Paul is so practical about how we relate to one another behind our front doors. And he wants us to enjoy mutual submission so that our homes are places of peace, even though they may be places of intense and frenetic activity. Well, now let's come to the workplace, shall we? What does Paul say about workers and employers? How should workers relate to employers? We'll find this in verse 5 of chapter 6. And Paul here talks about slaves. And in their society, the slaves were the lowest of the low. In fact, the fact that he talks of them here at all is significant because it shows they were there in the church. And that's fascinating. Because in God's plan of salvation, the church is a great leveller. I'm not sure whether it's going to happen today. I'm not sure who's pouring coffee. Actually, we need a few people more to pour coffee. But there are some Sundays where you can go out into the coffee, go out to have coffee, and your coffee will be poured by the CEO of a large company. I'm not going to tell you who he is, but he's there. And he'll pour you a coffee. You will never know him. The church is a wonderful leveller. And that was God's plan. That men and women, parents and children, bosses and slaves, all follow Christ together. And equally, we're all able to live in the Spirit and enjoy a deep and thrilling relationship with Christ. So Paul throws in this revolutionary principle for slaves. You're not just serving your boss, you're serving your Lord. Obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and in sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Now, this is not your boss equals God, heaven forbid. It's simply that if you want to know God's blessing, work as if you were working for Him. When we do this, it liberates us from just doing it because it's a job. Obey your masters with respect and fear. So when you get to work tomorrow morning, what could we do? Well, we could thank God that your desk is your front line. It's a sanctified place. It's a place where you can serve the Lord just as much as doing any service that has a Christian label to it. Workers to employers. Then Paul comes on to talk about how employers should relate to workers. That you'll find that in verse 9. I'm told there was a man who was very high up in his business, showing a friend of his around their huge office, and the friend said, "Gosh," he said, "how many people work here?" And the boss said, "About half of them." Oh, that's naughty. I can imagine the bosses in the audience when Paul was writing here, because his letter would have been read. It would have been read out loud rather than read from a book. I can imagine them thinking, "Yeah, Paul, when he talks about servants, yeah, Paul, you tell them, you lay it on thick." And they might be feeling just a bit smug when Paul comes in and says, "And by the way, you masters, treat your servants in the same way. Don't be lazy because you're the boss, or try to take shortcuts because you're the boss." And in particular, verse 9, "Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favouritism with him. If the church is a great leveller, so is heaven." He specifically urges bosses to avoid threats and bullying. And how easy it is to slip into threats or use aggression in the workplace. But here is Paul saying that it's a sign of a weakness of character. If mutual submission is to be demonstrated, it's to be shown as much to people who are whose job is much more basic than yours perhaps, or someone over whom you have authority. Don't provoke your workers. Well, we could go on a lot longer, but we won't. Let me just summarise what we've said this morning. When Paul comes to look at our relationships in the home and in the workplace, he picks on some of these key points of connectivity that we experience. And he says, "Wives, what should you do to your husbands? Submit to them, because that guards against manipulation. Husbands, what should you do for your wives? Love them, because that guards against me being selfish. Children, what should you do for your parents? Obey them, because that guards against rebellion. Workers, what should you do for your bosses? Just be diligent as if you're serving the Lord, because that guards against laziness. And employers, what should you do? Well, just respect your workers, because that guards against bullying. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." My friends, that's what brings joy and peace. That's what brings stability. That's what allows the Holy Spirit to work in all of our relationships wherever they happen to take place. That is theology with its boots on. Let's bow together in prayer.